Thank you, Carl. Sorry.
Okay, so welcome to my mini-teach on inclusive practice, and we're looking at equality, diversity and inclusion today. We're just going to have a brief recap of some of the material we've looked at, but first of all, the main outcomes of our lesson today. Just to recall the key features of an inclusive learning environment, to identify the practice of promoting equality and diversity, and identify how inclusive practice was demonstrated in today's lesson. So first of all, just very briefly, I've pulled a quote from Tomlinson's report on inclusion, which just says there, inclusive practice requires that you consider each learner as an individual with specific needs, likes and dislikes. You think about that as there's a lot involved, isn't there, in just achieving that. And then, I don't know if you ever looked at the college website. This one was actually, as it's quoted at the bottom, was pulled from the Edinburgh University website, and all colleges and universities have some information on their practice of equality and diversity. And whether you see in that list there anything in particular that sort of stands out to you, maybe any of those points in that list that really stand out. I mean, they're all important, aren't they? Do any of them sort of stand out more than others, maybe? Carl?
Well, like the fourth one, we often think of the students, but actually, we work with fellow staff, so it's helping both to reach their full potential.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's set forgotten.
Yeah.
I think the challenge inequality and discrimination is a really good point as well, because it does need to be challenged.
Yeah. Right. I kind of thought maybe if your students, well, particularly I think the staff, they're equipped with the skills to promote equality and diversity in the first place and inclusion, and they're going to be able to fulfil. It's not good having a list of all the sort of regulations, as it were, the legislation, but not having your staff trained in applying it. Okay, so here's just one example of promoting inclusion in some of the lessons that I did here in IT. So this is an example of a task which is worded in a way to include all learners. And what can you just pick out from that? What do you think about it is about that particular task that makes it inclusive?
As much information as you can find.
Very good. Yeah. Anything else? I'll show you. The next
Up
slide.
to 500 words.
Yeah. So as much as you can find, so that's up to, it might be Trevor, it might be Joe, and you might differ in what you can find, but then it says up to 500 words, so somebody might present only 100 words, but it may fulfil the brief, might it? And so it's inclusive in that way. This is a different one, promoting inclusion with differentiated questions and with self-assessment. In this case, I said choose one assignment and complete it in 5 minutes. So they've got three options there. The hardest being the first one. You probably think, well, they all look pretty hard to me. But for somebody who's in IT, that would be the harder one to do. And then I included a little section there in the yellow, sort of extension. If somebody feels that, well, that's all pretty easy, I could do all that, then they could do that as well. Just pulled out an example of how Tam did that with one of our lessons. You'll remember it. It's her slide. You remember that Tam had 2 sheets of vocab, and we had to choose one sheet and fill in the details, the information we had to go and do the research. Did you choose sheet 1 or 2? And so that was allowing you to assess yourself and think, well, I'll choose 1. So it's differentiated, wasn't it? And it allowed you to make a self-assessment as well. And of course, TAM include peer checking. We marked each other's, didn't we? Alright, so here's a little handout. Just give everyone one of these. Looks slightly different because there's enough room for you to write something in. Yeah. You just
recognise this.
Are you doing it or not? Alright, so just in a minute or two, have a look at that circumstance. You've got 12 students and only 6 computers, but you want only 1 student per computer. Imagine you've got 12 students, but you've only got 6 computers. But you must have a computer for each student. What are you going to do? How could we solve that?
Split the times.
You make a note of it. That's it. Any other ideas?
Pair them up.
Pair them up, but we only want 1 per computer.
I see.
Right. Now I came across this mostly because I was being assessed and I paired them up, and I didn't really want them paired up. I was faced with that circumstance and it didn't go very well. So I talked to Tam about it, how can we sort of figure a way out, and didn't really come up with a solution. Then I talked to Carl, Maestro, and he solved it, and this is what we did, and somebody's already mentioned it. We divided the group in half, so we've got 6 people, 6 students, 6 computers, and the other 6 went off and did a research activity. So that was inclusive because we needed just 1 computer for each student. The ability mixing, I just thought I made a note there. In that situation it wasn't really important because we just got 1 student on a computer and they were being led by the tutor. It might be if you were using a paired activity, like Carl was trying to pair us up with somebody who knew something and somebody who perhaps didn't know too much at all. You might want to do and consider that. I also had to provide resources, specific resources that weren't directly available. I was able to get some of the materials I needed through the IT department and then make up the resources. So each student, as it were, was on an equal footing. They'd all got the resources they needed in order to carry out the lesson. All right. Remember where I've just put this appropriate use of language, because one of my first lessons, we'll come to it in a moment, was really necessary to use I'm not talking about bad language type appropriate language, I'm talking about language that they'll easily understand. Remember the first few lessons we had with Tam and Richard, some of us were going, what's all this jargon? Yeah, well, because some of the phrases we'd never heard of. We'd never really been in a teaching environment before. So it was jargon to us, you see. I had to think about the students that I was teaching. Although they were IT, level 3, they knew pretty much nothing about what I was going to be teaching. This is one of the slides, and I was saying, well, what is Linux? Okay, well, you probably don't really know what it is. Well, it is basically a name for an operating system, okay, like Windows or Mac. Linux is an operating system. And I use some familiar items that are related to Linux because they're all from open source software, which basically what Linux is all about. You'll have seen this one because it's on the college computers. It's called VLC, or Video LAN Client, or VLC Media Player or something. Yeah. Okay. LibreOffice, which is maybe you've seen Firefox before that one. Yeah. They are all the product of the open source community, which is really what's behind the operating system Linux. All right. So just help them get a feel of what Linux was about. It was all to do with open source. Something else, Linux is all about freedom. It doesn't cost anything, it's free to use, there's no licensing, it's developed and supported by a worldwide community of volunteers. Okay, so that's really all about including people, equality, isn't it, in itself? So the operating system itself is a little bit like that. I picked out this just as an interesting thing because there was this initiative, this One Laptop Per Child initiative, which was all about equality and diversity because it wanted to provide a laptop for every child in the developing world as cheaply as possible. And it was all driven by the open source community. But what I found interesting, I won't go into more details about it, but because it was all about equality and diversity and inclusion, I looked on their website and I found this slide. Now these students are all benefiting from that arrangement. They've all got one of these laptops that were provided. And yet it struck me as kind of ironic in a way because Afghanistan is by far and away not a leading light in equality and diversity. I just thought it was quite funny really. Alright, so thinking about promoting equality and diversity with a student who has a difficulty, in this case, with a prosthetic leg. So we've got, imagine a student who's not finding it easy to walk. Carl's got a bit of a limp. He struggles. What adaptations might we make? All right? You're awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know how to do it. Get one to Okay, so just think about that for a moment. What could you do? What would we need to think about in order to ensure inclusion, equality and diversity for a student that maybe has difficulty in that way? This I put in because one of the students at Porticare, where I was teaching, he did have this problem, although he didn't make a big thing of it when I spoke to him about it. Far from it. He asked, what would you need to do, do you think?
Ask him. The ones
Ask
that he asked for, because he wouldn't
Yeah.
want you to do it. He might not want you to do
Yeah.
anything.
Exactly.
You know, someone with one leg that did the kilometre and scan.
That's it, Mike. Yeah.
So-
Spot on.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, classroom furniture management.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, exactly.
But-
Have a look. Sorry.
I've got treating the same as everybody else.
Right.
So it doesn't matter.
Okay, yeah. That would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah. Have a look at the next slide. Key one was speak to the learner and find out their specific requirements. And I pulled that information out of our course book, you know, the actual course book for this. You'll find that in there. Consider the whole classroom. Is it accessible? Did you do anything to improve it? If you were maybe going outside, you might have to think about their needs that way. So I had a learner like that, but you wouldn't have anything done for him. He was quite happy to muddle around. Assessment. Oof. Go. You need to be born with rubber fingers or something, don't you? So get these bits of paper. Right. So just looking at those then, can you remember what type of question, this one maybe, what type of question I used to promote inclusion? What was it I used? Remember?
Was it the open one?
We used differentiated question, and we used self-assessment, because that was inclusive as well, which meant they could choose how difficult a task they wanted to take on. When I had limited resources, what solution did I use to ensure inclusion? Remember what we had?
We
Split the group.
Split the group. Excellent. And to adjust the lesson, obviously, as well, to meet the needs of the learners. And in some matters of equality and diversity, who might know best about limitations and requirements?
Individual affected.
The individual. There, excellent. So that concludes my lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.